Sargon's second channel, The Symposium, came out with a video here a month ago. Personal pronouns are inherently unreasonable. This should be good. Personal pronouns are only an issue because trans people are trying to get people to understand that they're totally arbitrary. And the mouth sounds we make to refer to people when not using their names are basically a social convention. And if you disagree with that, you're just wrong. Sorry. So let's see what Sargon has to say about personal pronouns and their inherent unreasonability. Sargon, take it away.
Hello and welcome to the Symposium. My name's Carl, and today I'm going to talk about why I think demanding that someone uses your personal pronouns is inherently unreasonable. So let's start with what the pronouns are for.
Let me see if I can guess. It's because it's compelled speech which violates freedom of speech or some bullshit like that, which doesn't even apply to most of Europe. They don't have the kind of freedom of speech laws that we do in America, as I understand it. Which is why it's always funny when I see Brit-bongers or other Europeans trying to claim freedom of speech when those laws don't exist in their country, as I understand it. If I'm wrong, please correct me. But, yeah, so pronouns are just used for referring to people either as a group or when you don't know their name, or just, I mean, we use them in like literature so that you're not just saying the person's name over and over again. But yeah, let's see what Carl has to say here.
You never use your own pronouns. You always say I. You don't speak about yourself in the third person as if you're not present. People never use your pronouns towards you. They say you. And people tend not to use your pronouns when in your presence because it's often considered offensive to do so. And in English, we have a phrase for this. It's called "Who's she?" The cat's mother. It's this.
But I could be referring to someone with. This is a really weird argument from Carl because quite often we use pronouns when we're referring to people who are in the same room, like go to him. Oh yeah, go see her about that. I don't know, talk to him about it. Those are common uses of pronouns in them. This idea that because they don't use them to refer to, this is a weird argument. Wow. What is a natural man, Ogre Warlock? What is a natural woman?
Disrespectful to refer to someone who is present by their pronouns rather than by their name or by addressing them directly. Pronouns are properly used in a context where two people are talking about the same known individual outside of that individual's presence. So you might say, did Carol go to the park today? No, I took her to the lake instead, if it was two parents talking about their baby daughter. Or perhaps, did Mark phone you? No, he texted instead. The she and the he are the pronouns being used, and they're not in the presence of the person, and they're not something that the person really would have much to think about on, because again, they're not even there. So the question is, do I have a reasonable obligation to obey your wishes even when you're not around with regards to how I describe your identity? In this case, your gender identity. But I think more broadly speaking, this would expand to that category of just your identity. Do I have the obligation, a reasonable obligation, to honor it when you're not there? And it's kind of hard to see why I would. Now, if I like you, then.
So, if I'm understanding his argument correctly, basically, using someone's preferred pronouns when they're not present is inherently unreasonable because they're not there to be affected by it, never mind the effect that using the wrong pronouns with someone has on their relationships. Like, I mean, for one thing, if you're talking to someone else, if you're talking to someone about someone else, and that the person you're talking about identifies as a woman, but you use he, him pronouns, that is invalidating. Now, they may never hear about that. That's a valid statement. They may never hear about that invalidation. But that doesn't mean that you're still not doing a transphobia or just being a shit about it if they're not trans. You know, you're just identifying them as a man because you're a dick, because you think they look mannish or whatever. See, Abby, is that her name in the new Last of Us 2, who looks kind of buff and like a fucking survivor in a post-apocalypse world, so people assumed she was trans. Point being, the way I talk is my business. Don't try to control the way I speak. Excellent thought, Ogre Warlock. We're not trying to control the way you speak. We're trying to get you to treat people with some basic human dignity. Calling someone by the incorrect pronouns is exactly the same as calling them by a name they don't like. Like, by that logic, I can call Carl here Steve, and it's exactly the same effect. And if you think only natural men use he pronouns, I got some news for you, my dude. There are lots. What lie? Gender is a social construct. It is defined as we define it. And as society changes and advances, those things, that what defines a man or a woman changes. 70 years ago, women wouldn't be allowed to wear pants. So you could assume if someone was wearing pants that they were a man, but that has since changed. So now pants are no longer gendered in the way they used to be. Not lying. It's accepting their identity. It's as simple as that. Right? Same as any other gender identity. Man is a social construct. Woman is a social construct. Yeah, exactly. You're getting it.
I might want to do that. That might be a choice that I would make for myself. But if you're not there, you don't know what I said to that other person. And so I don't see how it can affect you in any noticeable way.
It can affect people because it impacts how people interact with the individual in question. So again, to go back to our example, I'm talking to someone about someone else, and I use he, him pronouns when they identify as a woman. Well, that sends the message to the person I'm talking to that there's something illegitimate about their identity, about them identifying as she, her, as a woman. And that could have lasting impacts on their relationships. Social interactions are very complex, and the things uh, that influence and change those can be incredibly complex and subtle. So when you refer to someone using incorrect pronouns, as in the pronouns they don't choose for themselves, which I'll grant you, for like 97, 98% of people in the world at this point in time are the ones that are assigned at birth. I'll totally grant there's like 2 to 3% trans people in the world, or at least in America. So I will grant you that for 98% of people, using the ones that are assigned at birth is totally fine. But when you misgender someone, when you use he him pronouns for someone who identifies as a woman, or she her pronouns for someone who identifies as a man, that is shown through sociological studies to increase suicidality. Something as simple as using the correct pronouns reduces suicidality by a tremendous amount. And I know, oh, there's snowflakes, but it goes into a larger uh, persecution issue, oppression issue, where people are forced to hide who they are so that they don't get uh, what's the word I'm looking for here? Persecuted feels a little too strong, although it is pretty accurate. But they don't get harassed. That's the word I was looking for how they identify. I mean, it's functionally the same as, like, I had a friend in high school whose name was James. He refused to let anyone but his grandfather identify him as Jim or Jamie. We have no issue with that kind of identification. For me, I prefer to go by, to my friends in real life, JP. But when I meet someone new, that's typically how I identify myself. But if they introduce me as, if they use some other name, like my actual first name or whatever, I don't. It doesn't bother me that much. But I haven't had the kind of uh, systemic disenfranchisement that trans people have. So when you misidentify someone, when you misgender someone, what you're doing is you're sending a message to the people around you that their identity is invalid.
That we might, like in the case of misgendering, that I might have had a conversation with someone else in which
Ogre Warlock. It's not just wrong pronouns. It's a denial of their identity, which can cause, among other things, depression, anxiety, and suicidality. Using the wrong pronouns is just a tiny facet of it, but it's something that's very easy for people to fix. Simple. Just call someone by the pronouns they prefer. It's literally that simple. If it hurts you that much to call someone by the correct pronouns, then that is a you problem.
which you personally were misgendered, if you were offended by this kind of thing, it would require either my conversational partner or a third party to tell you that we had misgendered you, for you to know. And then it would have to be, it would essentially be like, second-hand offense, would it not? So on what grounds could you reasonably object to this? It seems that the only reason one would use like
By the same grounds that you could object to me calling you Frank, Carl. Because it's not your identity. It's as simple as that. You just want to make it seem like a bigger deal than it is to call someone by the correct pronoun so you can continue being your transphobic self. It's really as simple as that.
Z or Zir or whatever your new pronoun is, would be for political orthodoxy. It would be politically correct for its own sake for me to refer to that person as Zir. I would be adopting this new paradigm that the sort of social politics demands that one respects a person's pronoun even when they're not around. And what do you do if you don't know that person's pronoun? But that's a different.
You default to they them if you have reason to believe that they are not the gender they're presenting as, or if their gender presentation is somewhat ambiguous, just use they them. It's that simple. And again, there's this idea that I'm guessing Carl's going to go into here, maybe not, but I'm guessing, where trans people will flip out at you and scream at you about being a transphobe if you misgender them accidentally. And that's not the case. Now, I'm not saying that no trans person has ever flipped out at an accidental misgendering, but it's usually typically either the trans person was looking for a fight, and there are shitty people in all demographics. I'm not going to say trans people are perfect angels, but it could be the straw that broke the camel's back, so to speak, in a long line of misgendering issues they've experienced that day or that week or what have you. But generally speaking, if someone is misgendered accidentally, and I've worked retail, I have a friend who's worked retail for like almost 15 years now. And he said, yeah, it happens occasionally. Someone, I was like, is anything I don't be fine, sir? And it turns out they're a woman. And they say, oh, actually, it's ma'am. And he, oh, I'm sorry, didn't see that, or, whatever. My bad. That's all it has to be. It doesn't have to be this big flip out. And trans people generally don't want that kind of freak out because it's not fun, it looks bad, and it feeds into this stereotype. So again, if you see a trans person flipping out about being misgendered, there's probably more to it than just one or two acts of accidental misgendering. Source Ogre Warlock? And again, it's Crowder we're talking about, so we know it was deliberate.
Question. And this is usually laden in the language of how hurtful it would be.
Yeah, I'm speeding Carl up because he is talking like he's on Quaaludes or some shit. Jesus Christ.
When they found out that you did this. And so you either want to not hurt that person's feelings or you wish to be politically correct. So this is, for the second point, this is only an obligation if one believes in political correctness.
It's not a matter of not hurting their feelings. It's a matter of just, validating their identity, which we do every day for cis people, but apparently that's a step too far for trans people.
Correctness, or cares about the potentially hurt feelings of that particular person. For people who don't care about those hurt feelings, well, it seems unreasonable to ask them to have to care about that person's feelings. And for people who disagree with the idea of political correctness, I mean, the very notion of political...
if you want to be an asshole to every person you meet who identifies differently than you think they should, like you know them better than they know themselves, then by all means, hurt their feelings and misgender them. I mean, that's on you. But if you want to have positive, relationships with people, then maybe consider not being a dickbag? I'll take a look at that when I'm done with this video here, Ogre Warlock.
Correctness itself, I find kind of astounding, to be honest, because the implication is that there is a form of correct politics, and that the people who are politically correct are following that form of correct politics, which essentially implies that anyone who disagrees with you is simply wrong by definition when you have a political disagreement with someone. And the thing is, a person's political views are actually...
I mean, yes, conservatives are wrong when they disagree with progressives, because progressives have data on their side.
A reflection of their moral outlooks, it seems. And given how there's no moral law that means I have to care about everyone's feelings, or I have to agree with anyone else politically, it seems that this is totally unreasonable from the perspective of someone who doesn't agree that there is a thing called political, that there is a form of perfect and correct politics, or that they have to be...
Okay, Frank, since not caring about someone's feelings is a valid reason for misidentifying someone, I'm just going to call you Frank from now on, okay? So, Frank, you're wrong. There is ample evidence to show that the simple act of gendering someone correctly improves their mental health, their mental well-being, and their position in life. It's so simple. We're not asking for some huge effort from these conservatives who rail against misgendering. And unlike what Jordan B. Peterson got famous for, Bill C-16 in Canada, that was not a case of if you walk up to someone and call them a sir and they're a trans woman that you could go to jail for that. It was specifically targeted at employers and landlords and the like. to who use misgendering as a harassment tactic. It was not anything like what Jordan Peterson said it was.
Morally bound to respect the feelings of absolutely everyone on Earth. So, from a person who is unconcerned or opposed to political correctness, requiring that they adhere to these standards, even within the immediate presence of a non-binary individual, let alone when they're not there, could be seen as an offensive imposition on their personal autonomy. It doesn't just seem unreasonable, in fact. It seems outright tyrannical. You do not get to decide what I say about you in your absence. I think that's a fair barrier to put on someone else's claims over my behavior. I mean, just imagine if tomorrow.
There are definite limits on what you can say. Again, this all depends on if you want to maintain a positive relationship with someone. If you don't care, if you want to burn a bridge with someone, by all means, say whatever you like about them. But like, there are definite things you're not supposed to talk about people unless they're present, especially things that are generally considered negative. So this is disingenuous. Not surprising from Frank, but you know, him being disingenuous about what we should or shouldn't talk about someone. And again, pronouns aren't a big deal. It's not a big deal. It is a huge deal for trans people. But using the correct ones is not a big deal. Accidental misgenderings happen all the time. Like, no one is blaming someone for accidental misgenderings, but when it becomes clear that it is a pattern of accidental misgendering over time, then that's when we have an issue.
You walk into the office, and the person on the desk next to you decides that they were going to dress in a feathered superhero outfit every day and declare to everyone that they wanted to.
I mean, all pronouns are made up, Ogre Warlock. Yes. So yeah, you've got it. Yeah, you're getting it, dude.
Be called Falcon at all times. Would it seem unreasonable if the company then demanded that you would call that person Falcon upon pain of disciplinary action, and you would refer to them as a superhero when they were being referred to in absence? I mean, it doesn't just sound unreasonable, does it? It sounds ludicrous. But that's essentially what's happening when it comes to gender identity.
Except that gender identity isn't a costume. It's not a something they put on for show or whatever. It is a functional change in essentially their position in society. From man to woman, or woman to man, or man to non-binary, or woman to non-binary. It is a change in their gender identity, their gender expression, generally speaking. So you're using an argumentum ad absurdum for something that isn't real. You're just wrong here, dude.
And so the question really is, am I not the person who gets to decide determine how I describe someone else? Are we obliged to describe people how they would prefer?
Okay, last time I'm going to say this because he seems to be harping on about this. If you want to maintain a positive relationship with someone, whether it's interpersonal or working or what have you, then yes, you have an obligation to accept their identity, whether it's calling them, actually I prefer to be called Steven instead of Steve, or I prefer Robert instead of Bob. I mean, that's a classic shorthand that writers use for someone who is a self-absorbed prick, right? Someone introduces themselves as Robert, and their interlocutor calls them Bobby or Bob or something. And generally, if someone introduces themselves by a name, that's the name they prefer to be called. So that's that's a shorthand, but you're trying to explain that not using someone's preferred pronouns when they're not present is perfectly acceptable because they can't tell me what to do. You're right, dude. We can't tell you what to do. But if you want to have a relationship, and given the increasing acceptance of trans people, the circle of people you're going to be able to have a positive relationship with if you misgender people when they're not present is shrinking. So, this is the thing. If you don't believe in trans people, if you don't accept their identity, whatever, I mean, you're wrong, but okay. Uh, Bye, base liberty. Fuck off. But it, if you maintain the aesthetics of accepting it, then that can go a long way towards improving your position. And while I would prefer people to understand gender theory and social theory and whatnot, maintaining the aesthetics is good for interpersonal communication, and especially since you don't actually believe it, it's going to come out eventually. You're going to slip up. So, but it's not compelled speech to request people use the correct pronouns when you're not present. It's as simple as that. I mean, it's as simple as if I started calling you, instead of Ogre Warlock, started calling you, gem encrusted or whatever. People act like it's so onerous to remember people's pronouns and use them correctly. But we remember people's names, and names have even less identity than I'm horrible with names. I am one of those people who will forget names seconds after I watch them or read them or hear them. So, you know, I I'm a little more forgiving of people who misname someone or something like that because it's an issue I myself have struggled with. And again, accidental misgenderings happen. Most people are reasonable about it. We'll watch Ogre Warlock's uh, video here in a second to see Crowder allegedly getting called out for accidental misgenderings twice in one day.
We already seem to have accepted the presupposition that we should not want to offend people. And on all of these things, I disagree. I don't think that someone else gets to describe how I describe, determine how I describe someone else. I don't think we're obliged to describe people how they would prefer, and I don't think that we should presuppose that we should not want to offend people. Are there not some people worthy of being offended? I mean, it might even be a moral good to deliberately offend people who act like petty tyrants and try to, in some vague attempt to curb their impositions on you in the future and on other people as well. A way of kind of
Is it okay to offend some people? I mean, I'm one of those people who doesn't really care too much when someone is offended just because they're offended. It depends on why they're offended. And if they're offended because you deliberately misidentify them, misgender them, use the wrong pronoun. Again, if someone introduces themselves as Robert and you call them Bobby, you're not going to think very highly of that person. Depending on the interaction, you may let it slide if they're a superior, or you probably aren't going to want to interact with that person very much. It's it's just that simple.
socially pushing back on the idea
What kind of question is that, Ogre Warlock? Men and women still exist, and they generally have different body shapes, which hormones can change. But a lot of clothing is unisex styled. So your argument is invalid.
that you are actually beholden to their will. People who make unreasonable demands can be discouraged from making unreasonable demands by simply refusing to assent to their presuppositions. And once they become aware that you simply do not share the same starting point, they will either have to persuade you or give up. For example, if the conversation between yourself and the pronoun police begins with, "We wouldn't want to offend people, would we?" If you respond with, "Actually, I think offense is a very useful social tool, and I certainly wouldn't want to take it off the table," then they cannot have the conversation with you that, when they're not around, you should use their pronouns, the pronouns of their choice, because otherwise it would be offensive.
See, you're doing the thing here, Frank. Why is offense a useful tool? Because I'll agree, offense is an excellent social tool in certain situations. But you're basically blanket saying that offending people is a good thing. There are lots of things you can do that offend people that I know you don't do. But this one thing which offends some people, but plays into your base, changes that is unacceptable. No, even you accept that there are offenses which you will not, words or actions you can take which would offend people which you won't do. Maybe Frank actually does it. Maybe I'm wrong now that I'm thinking about the "I wouldn't even rape her" comment. But most people, even those like myself who agree that offending people is a valid social tool, agree that there are actions and words people can take which have different which offend people but are not worth engaging in.
The assumption that you don't want to be offensive is the thing that we have drilled down to discuss. And sometimes you might want to be offensive. You might be dealing with someone whose views are absolutely abhorrent. They might be a child murderer or something. And they might be trying to get you to, in some way, consent to a position of their own. And you might completely agree. Well, I mean, some children deserve murder. No, I don't agree. Well, that you can't disagree, that's offensive. Well, I can, and maybe then you should.
Disagreeing being offensive is not in the same category as misidentifying someone being offensive. If you're offended that someone disagrees with you, then you either better have some strong data on why you're right, and even then, offense is probably not the right word to use there. Like, I'm not offended that anti-vaxxers disagree with science, as an example. That doesn't offend me. Their actions and statements about vaccines do offend me somewhat, but it's because they're obviously wrong. But their disagreeing with me doesn't offend me. Slippery Frank, just using the fact that some people are offended by disagreements as a reason to misgender people. Wow.
Should be offended. I mean, that's a ludicrous example, but you see what I mean. It's okay to offend the child murderer if they say that if they say that arguing against child murder is offensive. Well, then they can be offended, can't they? I don't care.
Because we know child murder is wrong. But we have mountains of evidence that trans people are valid and that their new identity is correct. So that's complete non sequitur, complete wrong argument.
Care if their moral tastes are inflamed at this point. Do I care if the moral tastes of people who are using those moral tastes to, well, I mean, I don't want to say oppress because it's a common and overused word, but to make people do as they want against their own better judgment? Do I not want to offend those people? Do I care about whether they're offended? I don't think I do. And so, if we establish the sort of moral ground to reserve to ourselves the right to offend, then the entire conversation ends up becoming resolved in your favor. Now, that doesn't mean you have to be offensive. That doesn't mean you can't use their pronouns. You might choose to do it. But the point is, you don't have to do it. You shouldn't feel compelled to do it, because it is an unreasonable demand that is being made of you that at all times you must.
You've not demonstrated why it's unreasonable. You've stated that not using it could offend them, and while I generally agree that someone being offended isn't generally a good argument for not doing something, because just about any action someone is going to find offensive, the fact that your actions in that way directly lead to harm of these people, that is offensive.
Use these pronouns, or else. There is no or else. Or else what? Or else the person will be offended and hurt. well, maybe that person should consider not making unreasonable demands of others that are a direct imposition, especially when many of those people, most of those people in fact, do not believe in political correctness and do not have a responsibility not to hurt your feelings, especially in this regard.
Okay, Frank. Wow. So basically, you're saying that because some people are offended by the request to use their some people are offended by people misgendering them and ignoring all the other reasons why they request being properly gendered, that we can just ignore misgendering. Gotcha. Okay. Hey, thanks for watching. Hope you enjoyed the show. Remember to like, share, and leave a comment because it helps me. Subscribe and ring that bell to help you. Thanks, and we'll see you next time.